The sun had set on the small town of Maplewood, casting long shadows across the streets. People had locked themselves indoors, hoping to avoid the dangers of the outside world. But some couldn't resist the call of a new drug that had hit the streets. Jenny was one of those people. She had heard about the new drug from a friend, and the curiosity had gotten the better of her. She found herself walking down the dark alley, searching for the dealer. "Hey, you looking for something?" a gruff voice said from the shadows. Jenny jumped, her heart pounding. She turned to face the source of the voice and saw a man leaning against the wall. He wore a hoodie and a bandana covering his face. "Yeah, I'm looking for the new stuff," she said nervously. The man pulled out a small plastic bag filled with white powder. "This is the good stuff," he said, his voice low and menacing. Jenny handed him the money, and the man gave her the bag. "Enjoy your trip," he said with a smirk. Jenny didn't waste any time. She hurried home and locked herself in her room, eager to try the new drug. She snorted a line and waited for the effects to kick in. At first, she felt euphoric. Colors seemed brighter, and the music sounded better. But then something changed. The world around her began to warp and twist. Shadows danced on the walls, and the air seemed to thicken. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She felt like she was drowning in darkness. The drug had taken control of her mind. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. "Jenny, are you okay?" her roommate called out. Jenny tried to answer, but her throat felt tight. She stumbled to the door and opened it, revealing her roommate's concerned face. "What's wrong? You look pale," her roommate said, noticing the sweat on her forehead. "I don't feel so good," Jenny croaked. Her roommate took one look at the bag of drugs on the table and knew what had happened. "Oh my God, Jenny. You took that new drug. We need to get you to the hospital." Jenny's mind was foggy, but she knew her roommate was right. They rushed out of the apartment, hoping to find help. But outside, they found chaos. People were stumbling around like zombies, their eyes glazed over. Some were screaming in agony, while others were laughing hysterically. "What's going on?" Jenny asked, her heart racing. "It's the drug. It's infected everyone who's taken it," her roommate said, her voice shaking. Jenny's eyes widened in horror. The drug had turned people into monsters. They ran as fast as they could, dodging the crazed drug users. But everywhere they looked, there was more horror. Buildings were on fire, and cars were overturned. The town was in ruins. "We have to get out of here," Jenny said, panting from the exertion. Her roommate nodded, and they kept running. But they soon realized that there was no escape. The infection had spread too far, and there was no place to hide. As they ran down the street, they heard a blood-curdling scream. They turned to see a figure stumbling towards them. Its eyes were black, and its skin was mottled. It was a monster. Jenny and her roommate froze in terror, unable to move. The monster lunged at them, and everything went black. The next thing Jenny knew, she was lying in a hospital bed. Her body ached, and her mind was fuzzy. But she was alive. She looked around the room, hoping to see her roommate. But there was only a nurse checking her vitals. "Where's my friend? Is she okay?" Jenny asked, her voice weak. The nurse looked at her sympathetically. "I'm sorry. Your friend didn't make it. She was infected by the drug too." Tears welled up in Jenny's eyes. She couldn't believe that her curiosity had led to such a horrific outcome. Suddenly, a doctor burst into the room. "We need to move you, now," he shouted, grabbing Jenny's arm. "What's going on?" she asked, alarmed. "The infection has spread to the hospital. We're evacuating everyone," the doctor explained, pulling her out of bed. Jenny stumbled after the doctor, her mind racing. She couldn't believe that the nightmare was still continuing. As they ran down the hallway, they saw infected patients clawing at the doors. The doctor pushed Jenny into an elevator and hit the emergency button. "Please, get us out of here," Jenny begged. The elevator doors opened, and they stumbled into the lobby. But it was too late. The infected had already overrun a hospital. Jenny and the doctor ran for the exit, dodging the monsters. But they were outnumbered, and the odds were not in their favor. Suddenly, a hand grabbed Jenny's shoulder. She turned to see a monster towering over her, its eyes full of madness. But before it could attack, a gunshot rang out. The monster fell to the ground, revealing a group of survivors holding weapons. "Come with us if you want to live," one of the survivors said, motioning for Jenny and the doctor to follow. They ran after the survivors, hoping that they had found a way to escape the nightmare. But Jenny knew that the horrors of the drug outbreak would haunt her for the rest of her life. Jenny and the doctor followed the survivors through the empty streets, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The survivors were heavily armed, and they moved with purpose, scanning their surroundings for any signs of danger. "What's your plan?" Jenny asked, her heart still pounding from the encounter with the monster. "We're headed to the edge of town, where we have a safe house," the leader of the group said. "We have supplies and weapons there, and we're hoping to regroup and figure out what to do next." Jenny nodded, grateful to have found some allies in this nightmare. As they walked, she noticed that the streets were eerily quiet, with no signs of life. "How did this happen?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How did the drug turn people into monsters?" The doctor spoke up, his tone grave. "It's a new synthetic drug, designed to heighten pleasure and sensation, but something went wrong in the manufacturing process, and it caused a genetic mutation in those who took it. It's like a virus, spreading rapidly and uncontrollably." Jenny shuddered, realizing the severity of the situation. The drug outbreak had turned her town into a living hell, with no way out. As they approached the safe house, they heard a commotion coming from inside. The survivors tensed, their weapons at the ready. "Stay back," the leader said, gesturing for Jenny and the doctor to stand behind them. They cautiously approached the door, ready for whatever lay inside. But what they saw shocked them to the core. Inside the safe house, there were infected survivors, struggling and writhing on the floor. They were in the throes of the mutation, their bodies twisting and convulsing. "We have to put them out of their misery," one of the survivors said, raising their weapon. Jenny felt sick to her stomach. She couldn't believe that this was happening, that people were being turned into monsters right before her eyes. But there was no time to dwell on the horror. The survivors had to act fast if they were going to survive. As the survivors fought off the infected, Jenny and the doctor tried to help as best they could. They administered medicine and tended to wounds, hoping to keep the survivors alive. But it was a losing battle. The infection had spread too far, and there was no cure in sight. As the night wore on, the survivors began to lose hope. They had lost too many of their own, and the odds were stacked against them. Jenny sat huddled in a corner, her mind numb from the horror. She couldn't believe that this was her reality now, that she was fighting for her life in a world overrun by monsters. But she knew that she couldn't give up. She had to keep fighting, for her own survival and for the sake of those who had been lost. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the survivors made a decision. They would leave the town and try to find safety elsewhere, in the hopes of finding a cure or a solution to the horror that had befallen them. Jenny and the doctor joined them, knowing that there was no other choice. They left the town behind, haunted by the memories of the drug outbreak and the monsters it had created. But they knew that they couldn't give up. They had to keep moving, keep fighting, in the hopes of finding a way to end the nightmare once and for all. As they walked through the desolate countryside, the survivors kept their weapons at the ready, scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. Jenny walked alongside them, feeling a sense of camaraderie with these strangers who had become her allies. "How much further to the next town?" she asked, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "It's a few miles up ahead," the leader of the group said, gesturing to the horizon. "We have some intel that there might be a military outpost there. They might have supplies and information on what's happening." Jenny nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was a chance to end the nightmare, to find a cure or a way to stop the spread of the infection. But as they approached the town, they saw that it was no different from their own. The streets were deserted, and there were signs of struggle everywhere. "They've been hit too," one of the survivors said, pointing to the smashed windows and broken doors. Jenny felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. If even the military couldn't contain the outbreak, what hope was there for them? As they approached the outpost, they saw that it had been overrun by the infected. The gates were breached, and there were bodies everywhere. "We have to be careful," the leader said, gesturing for them to keep their distance. There might still be some infected inside. Jenny felt her heart pounding in her chest. They had come so far, only to be met with more horror and death. But they had to keep going. They had to find a way to survive, no matter what. As they moved through the outpost, they saw signs of struggle everywhere. The infected had taken over, and the military had fought valiantly to keep them at bay. But it hadn't been enough. As they reached the inner sanctum of the outpost, they found a small group of soldiers, barricaded in a room. They were weary and bloodied, but they had managed to survive. "We've been trying to hold out for as long as we can," one of the soldiers said, his voice strained. "But we're running low on supplies and ammunition. We don't know how much longer we can last." Jenny felt a pang of sympathy for these soldiers, who had been tasked with protecting their town and their country, only to be met with such horror and despair. But there was still a chance to end the nightmare. The survivors and the soldiers could work together, pooling their resources and knowledge to find a way to stop the spread of the infection. As they huddled together in the barricaded room, they began to formulate a plan. They would gather any remaining supplies and weapons, and try to make their way to a nearby research facility. It was a long shot, but it was the only hope they had left. Jenny felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had survived this long, and she wasn't going to give up now. Together, they made their way out of the outpost, their weapons at the ready. They would face whatever horrors lay ahead, knowing that they had each other to rely on. As they stepped out of the outpost, the group immediately saw that the infected had closed in on them. They were surrounded by a horde of snarling, mutated creatures, their eyes glazed over with madness. The soldiers quickly formed a defensive line, their weapons trained on the approaching horde. The survivors stood behind them, their own weapons at the ready. "We need to hold them off," the soldier who had spoken earlier said. "If we can make it to the trucks, we might be able to break through their lines." Jenny nodded, feeling a surge of adrenaline. She had never been in a battle before, but she was determined to do whatever it took to survive. As the infected drew closer, the soldiers opened fire. Gunshots rang out, filling the air with the acrid smell of gunpowder. The survivors joined in, firing their own weapons at the encroaching horde. The infected came on relentlessly, their numbers seemingly endless. But the survivors and the soldiers fought on, driven by a fierce determination to survive. As they battled their way through the horde, Jenny felt a sense of awe at the soldiers' bravery. They were vastly outnumbered, but they never gave up. At last, they reached the trucks, but their victory was short-lived. The infected had surrounded them, and there seemed to be no way out. "We need to make a break for it," the soldier said, his voice urgent. "We can't stay here." Jenny nodded, feeling a sense of desperation. They had come so far, but it seemed that their journey was doomed to end in failure. But then, a miracle happened. Just as they were about to make a run for it, a group of helicopters appeared overhead. They were military choppers, sent to rescue any survivors they could find. The soldiers quickly signaled for the choppers to land, and they clambered aboard, followed by the survivors. As the choppers took off, Jenny felt a sense of relief and gratitude. They had made it out alive, but the horrors they had seen would stay with them forever. As they flew away from the infected town, Jenny knew that they had a long road ahead of them. But they had survived this far, and with their newfound allies, they just might have a chance at ending the nightmare once and for all. As the choppers flew away, Jenny couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. She turned to one of the soldiers and asked, "What do we do now? How do we stop this outbreak from spreading?" The soldier looked at her, his face grim. "We don't," he said. "We just contain it as best we can. That's all we can do." Jenny's heart sank. She had hoped that they could find a way to stop the outbreak and save the world from this nightmare. But it seemed that they were fighting a losing battle. As the choppers flew on, the survivors began to relax, believing that they were safe at last. But then, something strange began to happen. One by one, they started to feel sick. Their skin grew pale, their eyes turned red, and they began to cough up blood. Jenny looked around, horror-stricken. "What's happening? What's wrong with us?" The soldier who had spoken earlier looked at her, a look of resignation on his face. "The infection," he said. "It's airborne now. There's no way to stop it." Jenny felt a sense of overwhelming despair. They had fought so hard to survive, only to succumb to the very thing they had been fighting against. As the survivors began to die one by one, Jenny could hear the soldier muttering to himself. "We thought we could contain it," he said. "We thought we could stop it. But in the end, it was too powerful for us." Jenny knew that she was going to die too, but she refused to give up. She fought on, even as her body grew weaker and weaker. And then, as she took her last breath, she saw something that filled her with terror. The soldier who had spoken earlier was standing over her, his eyes glowing with a strange, otherworldly light. She tried to scream, but it was too late. The infection had consumed them all, and now, they were all lost to the darkness.